If you would, I would ask you to take out a Bible or a Bible app and turn it to the Gospel of Mark, the second Gospel, and the 16th chapter of that book. The 16th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. I'm not going to read it yet. I will do so in a minute. I say this, I try to say this every Resurrection Sunday. The resurrection of Jesus is the seminal event of Christianity. The seminal event of Christianity. Think about this for a minute. If that Jesus did not walk out of that tomb on that Sunday morning, if he did not actually get up and walk out of that, then all of what Jesus did and all of what he taught would be lost to the dustbin of history. We would not know him. In fact, this Jesus would be nothing more than a footnote in a history book in some dusty portion of the library. There would be no knowledge of this Jesus. If this Jesus did not walk out of the tomb, then there would be no New Testament. There would be no church. The last 2,000 years of history would look very different. And all of Western civilization, which is built upon this reality, would not be what it is. I don't know what our civilization would look like today if it were not for that particular event taking place some 2,000 years ago. But most importantly, if Jesus was not raised from the dead, then there's absolutely nothing supporting any faith in him as the source of our redemption. And as Paul himself says in 1 Corinthians 15, we're to be pitied amongst all men, because we put our faith in a man who cannot save us. We put our faith in something that is preposterous. The resurrection of Jesus is the seminal event of Christianity. It is, in my opinion, the exclamation point on the end of the statement of Jesus himself from the cross. It is finished. Now, when I say something is a seminal work, the word seminal means something that strongly influences later developments. A seminal event is something that starts what follows from it. It's a work or an event or a moment or a figure that strongly influences what has come. In other words, someone or something that becomes the foundation from which future realities flow, the starting point of a set of realities to come. Abraham, as we read this morning, was a seminal character in the Old Testament. He was the one from which Israel came. It was from him. He was the seminal. He started all of what would come. The resurrection of Jesus on that fateful Sunday starts all of what flows out of God's character to his people. It is the seminal event of the Christian faith. The resurrection of Jesus should have then a certain emotional character to it. And I'm specifically using the word emotional here. What should be our emotional response to this reality? How should the resurrection of Jesus make us feel? How should it make us feel? Now, this is a particularly relevant question because in so much of Christendom today, the primary emphasis is on how we feel. So much of Christianity today is built not upon objective facts like a man walking out of a tomb, but rather how those facts make us feel or how those ideas or concepts make us feel. So it seems to me that if emotionalism is going to be at the core of the modern faith, let's address what the emotion ought to be that we have as we come to an empty tomb. And let me rephrase my question this way. Is it possible that our feelings about the resurrection may in fact be misplaced? That they may in fact be wrong? That the intention of the resurrection is to produce an additional, completely different feeling than that which normally surrounds this Sunday of the year? And we sort of have an assumption, right, that there's a certain way that Easter ought to make us feel. There's a sort of a typical emotional response today. I sat in my office for quite a while trying to describe what it is. I really did. And I came up with this. This is what it's: a now defunct cultural likeness characterized by pastel colors. That's how I looked at it. A now defunct lightness characterized by pastel colors. Maybe that emotion, that feeling, should be tempered by another. It should be tempered by one that is very ancient and very immediate. And that's where I want us to go this morning. Let me advance the following thought to you then as my thesis. Although it is good and right to be consciously joyful at the news of the resurrection. I mean, I admit, it is the completion of our redemption. Yes, it is the exclamation point on the sentence, it is finished. And so, yes, we look to the empty tomb and recognize it is because Jesus walked out of that tomb that we're able to say, I have been rescued from the domain of darkness and death. Sure, that ought to be true. Yes, we should be consciously joyful. But it is also good and right to feel something else, an emotion that appears regularly in the gospel accounts of the event. So here's what I want to do this morning. I want to help you to understand or find this emotion. And I want to do so by giving to you a harmony of the accounts of the immediate discovery of the open tomb by the women. I want to just focus our attention on a tiny sliver of the story, which is the women who come to the tomb on that Sunday morning. And I want you to see the reaction in them, which should give us pause to ask why. And I've taken you specifically to Mark's gospel because I think it does justice to where I want to go with this thought. So let me now read to you this account of Matthew's gospel starting in chapter 16, verse 1. When the Sabbath was past, in other words, when Saturday was over and now Sunday comes, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, because as I said this morning, the sunrise becomes the start of a new day, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, here's how I want to harmonize this account. I want to I want to walk you through the events, and I'm going to harmonize from the four gospel accounts what actually takes place on this particular Sunday morning. All four of the gospel accounts tell us that this occurs on Sunday. And you will notice in your Bibles that the resurrection account begins a new chapter in each of the four gospel accounts. So here in Mark, it starts in chapter 16, in Matthew it's 28, Luke it's 24, and John it's 20. So all four of the accounts make mention of the fact that this occurs early in the morning on Sunday. And all four of the accounts note the names of the women who went to the tomb. They're all identified by name. Although the accounts differ between them, they will all make mention of the names of some, particularly Mary Magdalene, who is mentioned in all four. In the first verse of Matthew, Mark, and John's accounts, and also in the 10th verse of chapter 24 of Luke's account, Mary Magdalene is mentioned as the primary woman who went to the tomb. That's followed by Mary, the mother of James, according to Mark's gospel here. Matthew's gospel just calls her the other Mary. She doesn't actually get identified. She just called the other Mary. But there's another Mary that goes along to the tomb. And then there are two additional women mentioned, Salome here in Mark's gospel account and Joanna in Luke's account. Now, we're not sure if that's the same woman or not. It could be, because they're both mentioned in the same spot in both accounts, or it could be just that Mark chose to include Salome and not Joanna, and vice versa. In Luke's account, we don't know. It could be the same woman or different women. And then finally, Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, lists other women as well. He doesn't give the names of them, but he just says other women. So we can conclude then that there are at least 4 and possibly 5 women who go out on that morning to the tomb for the purpose of anointing the body. And a couple of them get their names ensconced permanently. Thirdly, 2 of the accounts note that the women went to the tomb to prepare the body. Now, only Mark's Gospel and Luke's Gospel make note of this, that they went to prepare the body. Remember, according to the previous accounts, they had no time on Friday after they took the body down from the cross and laid it in the tomb. They didn't have time to complete the burial process according to Jewish custom. So they quickly wrapped the body, threw some spices on it, rolled the stone in place, and left. They had to do that before sundown in order that they wouldn't be caught in a tomb on the Sabbath day. And so they had to leave quickly. Now that the Sabbath is over, they want to come back to finish what they started on Friday. Mark indicates that the women bought the spices on Sunday morning, that they went out and found a merchant somewhere that they could purchase burial spices from, and they bought those spices. Luke only says that they brought what they had prepared. He doesn't make mention of when they got them, just that they had them. And John notes in his account, according to 1939, that there were some that were already brought by Nicodemus on Friday. That's probably those that were used in the initial, rather rushed process of burying the body. Matthew's account and John's account simply note that Mary went to the tomb, Mary Magdalene that is, went to the tomb to see it. He doesn't make mention, these 2 men don't make mention of the fact that they were going there for a purpose. But I suspect everybody reading the story already knew that, so they probably just didn't include the details. Now, Mark's Gospel notes something uniquely, and that is he notes that the women, as they're walking to the tomb with their spices, are concerned about how to get in. Because as Mark's Gospel points out, there's a very large stone that's been rolled there. Plus, what we're not told from this account, but we learn from others, is that this stone had been sealed by the Roman guards and that the guards had been posted at the tomb. And so they're wondering, how are we going to get in? How are we going to get into the tomb to finish what we were supposed to do? Now, 3 of the accounts, other than Mark's Gospel, note that the stone had already been moved away. Mark's Gospel does mention that, but he doesn't mention how. Luke's Gospel and John's Gospel also include that detail. But Matthew's account records the event of an angel having rolled that stone away. Now, if you read Matthew's account carefully, I am convinced that the event of the angel rolling the stone away, even though it's included in the midst of the women going to the tomb, that actually preceded the women going, that it occurred in the night somewhere as this Jesus walks out of the tomb. And Matthew simply records it here as a way of explaining how it is that the woman would be able to get in. So I think it's a preceding event of the angel rolling the stone away. You could say that the stone is rolled away by this angel. The soldiers are struck dead by what takes place. They're in big trouble, by the way, for what has now happened. And so they run back to the religious leadership to try to get this resolved. So by the time the women come, they're gone, and the tomb is already open. The Synoptic Gospels, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, note then that when the women arrive, they enter the open tomb. They go in and they look. They go in. Now that would seem logical, right? Since they were there to anoint the body, so it would be under the assumption that they would, when they arrive, they'd go in and check it out. But the stone being rolled back gives them pause for a moment before they go in to go, something's going on here. That stone should not be rolled back. Luke's Gospel and John's Gospel note that there are 2 angels inside. Mark only records 1, but I think that's simply because the one angel that spoke is the one that Mark refers to. The other one is probably just sitting there watching and is part of the event as well. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, also record the announcement of the angels inside. What do these angels say to these women when they come in? And there are 4 things that the angels say. Here's the great announcement. Number 1, You seek Jesus who was crucified. You seek Jesus who was crucified. In other words, you have come to the right tomb. Okay? You come to the right tomb. You haven't made a mistake. Yes, the tomb is open, so you might be assuming that this was some unused tomb and that you got it wrong. In fact, our Muslim friends will argue this point that the women went to the wrong tomb because it was early in the morning and they didn't really know where they were going. But the angel inside says, nope, you've come to the right tomb. This is where he's been buried. Okay? Number two, he is not here, for he has risen. Okay, now that's the key phrase, right? He is not here, he has risen. All right? In other words, he's not been moved. The body's not been stolen. Right? The guards haven't picked up the body and moved it somewhere else. The religious leadership hasn't moved it somewhere else. No, he's not here because he has risen. So they saying directly to the ladies that come to the tomb, the reason he's not here is because he has risen from the dead. Thirdly, in Luke's gospel, Luke adds a detail. In 24:7, the angel says, remember how he told you this all must happen. In other words, the angel says to the ladies, this is to fulfill all that he foretold about himself during his public ministry. What's happening here should not be a surprise to you because he already told you this was going to happen. And then fourthly, Matthew's account and Mark's account says, the angel says, tell his disciples that he will meet them in Galilee. In other words, he's going to go already up to Galilee where you're familiar with him because you spent most of your time with him up there. Go up there and he will meet you there. In other words, this will be to confirm his bodily resurrection before many witnesses. You will see him. He will make himself known. For now, he's not here, but he will make himself known to you. So notice the four things the angel says. You seek this Jesus. You've come to the right place. He's not here, for he has risen. That's the key phrase. This is all part of what he himself said would happen, and you will see him if you go to Galilee. So the angels give specific instruction to these women about what they are seeing. The Synoptic Gospels then, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record the report by the women to the disciples. All of the women then go back to the disciples. Now, Matthew's gospel and Mark's gospel includes the fact that they are initially inclined not to say anything. But they eventually report what they had seen and heard. In fact, in Matthew's gospel it says that they said nothing to anyone. But that's a temporary muteness. Okay? They are initially inclined not to say anything, but they eventually do. And you remember, according to Luke's gospel and John's gospel, Peter and John run to the tomb then after these women make their announcement, and they run to see what has taken place. They run to see it for themselves. And according to John 20 and verse 10, they see it empty and they leave. The Synoptic Gospels then, all three of them, record the reactions of the women to their initial discovery of the empty tomb and the message of the angels. Okay, and this is the part where I'm keying in on. You have these women who decide on early Sunday morning to pack up their spices and go and finish the work. They get to a tomb, it's open. They then stick their head in and discover it's empty, except for a man who's inside, who, as we discover in the text, is an angel. They don't probably know that. This angel tells them these realities. You've come to the right place. This is where Jesus was buried. He's not here. He has been raised. He will meet you in Galilee. You should have understood all these things. But then there's a reaction here. It is true that they run back to the disciples, but what are they feeling when they do so? Matthew records their reaction in Matthew 28:8 as one of fear mixed with joy. He says it this way: so they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. So there was a mixture of emotions in them as they run off. They have one of joy, but also with fear simultaneously in the account. As we read here in verse 8, Mark records their reaction as one of fear with trembling and astonishment. And then they went out and fled from the tomb, For trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Luke's gospel records their reaction as one of remembering what Jesus had said. Now, Mark doesn't give us that little clue, but Luke does. And they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to the rest. There is a sense of memory that has been jogged by what Jesus has said. Now, again, don't read into this that they fully understand what it is that has happened here, but there's some sense of, well, he said something about this, and I guess that's probably true. So as I take those three different accounts of the reaction of the women, I would say this. After the women discover the tomb open and hear the message of the angels, they run back to the disciples, and the synoptic writers tell us what they were feeling and thinking at the time. What is their emotional state as they come to an open tomb, which they then discover is empty, and then they discover that this Jesus has been raised from this tomb? Their emotional reaction as they run back to the disciples, what are they feeling at this point? Now, I'm going to make a strong assumption here, and you are free to disagree with me if you like, because many have for centuries. But I'm going to assume that what you have in your Bible as the longer ending of the book of Mark doesn't actually belong. The verses from verse 9 to verse 20 are probably not original to the Gospel of Mark. And I could spend an hour just on why I think so. Just let me give you a quick reasoning why I think not. First, these verses are not found in some of the oldest and best manuscript copies of this Gospel that we have. Secondly, there are early church fathers who admit that these verses are not authentic. Thirdly, there are serious differences within the passage amongst the various manuscripts that do have it. In fact, there's something called a shorter ending and a longer ending that are included in different manuscripts, and they're very different from one another. And then fourthly, and probably the biggest reason why I don't think this belongs, is because the very last verse of the Gospel, verse 8, if my assumption is correct, requires an epilogue. It requires one. Because the natural question you may ask is, so that's how Mark ended his gospel? With women running away in fear and trembling? That seems rather odd. In fact, that's, I think, the primary reason why the longer ending gets tacked on is because somebody along the way goes, I need to finish the story. So I'm going to borrow a few things out of Matthew's gospel and a few things out of Luke's account, and I'm going to stuff them in there. And much of what you read, in fact, starting in verse 9 and going all the way to verse 20, is very summarized, and much of it is parallel to the other accounts almost exactly. And very summarized, in a sense. So it seems to me that the gospel ends rather strangely, so it seems reasonable for someone to add such an epilogue and clear up the ambiguity left behind. Because the natural question you would ask is, okay, what happens next? But what if there is some significance to Mark ending his gospel this way? What if Mark purposely stopped writing at this point because this is what he wanted to leave his audience with? What if the last thought that he wanted set in the mind of his audience was a group of women running away from an open and empty tomb with fear and trembling? What if that's the last thought that he wanted to leave with his readers? Now, is this not where all of us are, in fact, when we first encounter the concept of the resurrection? Now, just stop for a minute, okay, because I know, here's what the natural inclination would be. Not later when we have more to go on, okay? Not later, as all of us are, sitting 2,000 years removed from the event. We now have, For those of you who've been in the church of any length of time, you've had lots of sermons on the subject in Sunday schools and so forth. And so all of the events afterwards, right? All of the things that follow after this, the appearances of Jesus, all of the witnesses, including Thomas, Pentecost, the conversion of Paul, all the epistolatory material that's written as a result of it, 2,000 years of church history, and hundreds of Easter sermons that we've heard preached. All of that. No, not that. Before that. That initial moment in which we are forced to stand in front of an open and empty tomb and ask a question, what is this? At this point, like these women, our first encounter with the idea that Jesus has risen from the dead. Like these women, having, some information, basically a message they don't quite understand fully, given by people they don't quite understand fully. And having to go away from the empty tomb to decide what to do with it. Because that's in essence of where you would be if you are a first century Jew, for example, and someone hands you the scroll of Mark's gospel and you read this final bit and you get to the end, and guess what you are forced to do? You are now in the same place as those women are. You have to stop and ask yourself a question. What does this empty and open tomb mean to me? Here's the irony of this. This gospel account, the second gospel, is written by a man who has a history of running away. It's written by a man who we know as John Mark, who went along with Paul on his first missionary journey with Barnabas as they went into inner Asia Minor to the area of Lystra, and Iconium, Derbe, Pisidia, Antioch of Pisidia, right? And somewhere during that first missionary journey, Mark became afraid and ran off. And when Barnabas and Paul decided to go on their second missionary journey, Barnabas said, "Let's take John Mark again." Paul said, ain't going to happen. The man runs away from the least little thing. I'm not having him with me. And they had such a disagreement over it that they were forced to go in opposite directions. Barnabas went one way and Paul went another. Paul took Silas and Barnabas took John Mark, and off they went. Now, Paul came to understand that Mark would become a valuable asset at some point later. He obviously grew up at some point, but you see the irony of this? This young man, John Mark, is writing this gospel years after that failure. Is it possible that as he gets to this point, he stops, he sets down his quill, and smiles, and says, I've been there. I know exactly what these women are feeling. So I'm going to leave it right there for the reader. What if John Mark really intended for us to come to the end of this gospel and be faced with a reality that we may not have thought of before? Is it possible that because of all that stuff I mentioned earlier, the appearances, the witnesses, Pentecost, conversion, the epistles, etc., is it possible that we have lost the visceral reaction the discovery of the empty tomb should produce in us? The visceral reaction, the true sense that should accompany such a revelation. Dare I call it the seminal event in your Christian faith. That very first thing that you encounter in this thing called Christianity. So let me ask a question. Why would these women have a response of fear and trembling in seeing the empty tomb? Why would that be their primary feeling as they come away from this tomb? Fear. Notice in verse 8 of this account, in Mark's account, he specifically gives to us the very clear impression that fear was the primary feeling at that moment. Fear and trembling. Yes, I know the other accounts talk about joy being added to it, but they also include fear as a reality in the hearts of these women. They're afraid. They have heard something. It causes them, in fact, as Mark's gospel accounts, to tremble. This fear was visceral to them at their very core. Their initial reaction is puzzling, isn't it? It should be. It should be puzzling. Given the message of the angel inside, as I gave it to you, the implications of what has happened and the fact that they remembered Jesus' own words. I mean, he said he was going to be raised after 3 days. They remembered this according to the accounts. And the implications of Jesus being alive should be something exciting, not fearful. So it's rather puzzling, isn't it, why they would feel fear running away from an open tomb. So let's speculate, shall we, of some reasons they may have felt fear. Now, the first one that I hear all the time, and I don't believe it for a minute, but the first one that I hear is, well, they were scared because they met angels in the tomb. Right? I mean, after all, if you met an angel, would you be afraid? Every character in the New Testament was. When the angels come, what's the first thing they say? Do not be afraid, right? I mean, even Mary was told, do not be afraid, right? Because this is the natural reaction that human beings would have to meeting a supernatural being of some sort. It's a common response to angels. Can that explain why they're running away in fear? I don't think so. You know why I don't think so? Because their fear continues after they leave even after they leave the tomb and are safely away from these beings. Their fear continues. It doesn't abate just because they leave the tomb. The sense of fear continues in them all the way to the point where even when they get back to the other disciples, they're reticent to talk about what they've seen. I'm not sure that it's angels necessarily. Now, that's certainly added to the equation. I'm not denying that. But I'm not sure that's the reason for the fear. A second answer that's often given is, well, they were frightened simply by the unknown. Because that's what we're most frightened of, right? The unknown. What is unknown to us often frightens us dramatically, which is why people get afraid in the dark. They've had the light on. They know where the furniture is. But when you turn the light off, it's kind of like, ooh, it gets spooky in here. Why? It's the same room. That's what I always say to people when they ask why I don't stay in 4-star hotels. Is because, well, you know, every hotel room in the world looks exactly the same with the lights off. Now, I realize they don't all smell the same, but they all look the same. They were frightened by the unknown, some say, that they were not aware of what had taken place. They didn't get it yet. But the message and their own memory of Jesus' words suggested, in fact, that they did have some understanding, crude as it might be at this point. There was a sense in which they did have some sense of understanding. And I would be inclined to believe that the fear they were feeling was mixed with joy, implying that this was not a fear of the unknown. One does not have a sense of joy in the midst of fear if one is completely afraid of the unknown. The joy is mixed in, I think, as an indication that they did understand, at least crudely, what it is that had taken place in that tomb. So for me, I think most likely their fear is from the implications of what this meant. The implications of what this meant. An open tomb that is now empty of the body, and the message from the angel that he has risen, and you can see him in Galilee. Just go back to Galilee and you'll see him there. There's implications to that. And it is that which causes fear. Because here's the deal, folks. Jesus, no longer being in that tomb, has turned their world completely upside down. Everything they had assumed up to this moment is now completely upside down. And what this might mean later had begun to set in. Now, again, not perfectly, I understand. There's only a limited understanding here, and they won't truly understand the risen Jesus until after he's even ascended and the Spirit comes and they begin to see the greater implications of all of this in the world. True. Their initial understanding is limited, but if Jesus really was alive, if he had in fact walked out of that tomb, it would mean radical changes in everything around them. Their lives would never be the same again. Their lives would never be the same again. The best proof of this that I have is the response of Peter and John. What do? They run to the tomb to see. And according to the fourth gospel, the unnamed John, the writer of the gospel, who Jesus loved, believes, it says. He understood that there were implications to the fact that Jesus was not in this tomb. Everybody who saw the empty tomb was beginning to understand their lives were never going to be the same again. Their fear was a healthy reaction to the realization that Jesus had predicted this. Do you understand what I just said? Their fear was a healthy reaction to the realization that Jesus had in fact predicted this. As the angel said, as he told you. Given that Jesus had based his entire ministry on the fact that he would rise from the dead, on his absolute conviction that he would rise from the dead, his actual resurrection verifies everything that he said. You understand that, right? Here's a man who walked around in Galilee for 3 years. And he preached truth, and he healed people, and he raised people from the dead. But the entirety of his ministry, all of it, was foundationed on one simple thing. You can believe me because after they kill me, I will rise on the third day and prove everything that I have said to be true. I mean, think about it. If this man says that he can be raised from the dead, that he will rise from the dead, that he will walk out of an empty tomb, you think you'd have a tendency to believe him when he says something else? That he alone, for example, was the way to God? When he said, I am the way and the truth and the life, no man comes to the Father except by me? When he walks out of that tomb, does he not verify that statement? You know, if he didn't walk out of that tomb, then guess what? He is not the way and the truth and the life. But listen to me, if he did walk out of that tomb, then he absolutely must be, because he said so. And if he is a man who can predict his own resurrection from the dead, certainly he can be found truthful when he says, I am the way to God. When he said that those who wish to follow him to God must go with him through the cross. He said that. You want to be my disciple? You got to go through a cross to get there. This isn't just a free lunch. This is self-sacrifice and self-denial. If he said that, and he also said he was going to rise from the dead, would that not mean something to us? When he said that true discipleship was found in self-denial and obedience to his lordship. When he walked around Galilee and said, listen, if you want to be my disciple, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And everybody who heard that ran off. When he said that, and then said, I will rise from the dead after 3 days, you think you ought to believe him? When he says, listen, true discipleship is found in self-denial and obedience? Or as the Apostle Paul put it, who I've often contended is the greatest commentator on Jesus that ever lived, to be saved from the wrath of God that is coming upon all who are in rebellion is to possess an existential belief in this resurrection. Your existence is based upon a confession, as he says in Romans 10:9. If you will confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. You need to understand, that statement's not based on conjecture. That statement is based on the fact that a man who walked around in Galilee said, I will be raised after 3 days. And here's the deal. You want to be with me? You want to follow after me? You've got to go through a resurrection like I did. You see, my friends, as we gather on this pastel kind of day, and yes, I picked the purple on purpose, there is joy to be found in the resurrection, yes. Yes, we can put the exclamation point on the end of the statement, it is finished. And we can say, yes, this Jesus died for me. He paid the price for sin, so I will follow him. I will believe this. But we need to have a healthy fear of the implications of the resurrection of Jesus. You know, we ought to be like these women. We ought to tremble at the fact that the tomb was empty. We take it for granted, don't we? We shrug it off. Yes, we celebrate the resurrection every Sunday. And that's why Christians worship on the first day of the week, on this day that these women went. Because we say every Sunday is Resurrection Sunday. But you know what? Familiarity breeds contempt. And the fact is that so very often we lose track of what the implications of this resurrection are. We must never stop being in awe that this man who claimed he would rise actually did. There are massive implications to all of our lives because this Jesus walked out of the tomb. You see, the resurrection undoes everything about Jesus that we have conjured up in our own minds. The resurrection, the fact of Jesus walking out of a tomb, undoes every view of Jesus that is not absolutely consistent with what he himself said. And he said many things. And those things have implications. You understand that? Today in our world, we live in a world now where people have conjured up a view or an image of Jesus in their own mind, and they have just made it up. This is Jesus. This is my friend, my pal. He is a great guy. He loves me and wants me to be this and that. And they've made up a version of Jesus, and it's inconsistent, entirely inconsistent with what the Scriptures reveal. Jesus talked about a few wonderful things about loving your neighbor, and so that must be the real Jesus, but it's not. The real Jesus is 4 gospel accounts full of words that he said and things that demand serious self-denial and self-discipline as he himself exhibited. And that is the implication of the resurrection. The fear that these women felt is a proper and healthy fear. We should be afraid. We should be afraid in our soul that we haven't invented a Jesus, but are following after the real one who has revealed himself in the Word of God and makes demands upon us. We should have that kind of fear. We must never lose sight of the central event of the Christian faith. It is. This resurrection is the central event of what took place to establish the Christian faith. Without the resurrection, there's nothing else. But it has implications. It has implications for how we understand Him, and it has implications of how we understand ourselves. It's good to be filled with joy today with the fact that Jesus has been raised. But let me suggest that you should also be afraid. Be very afraid. For what this Christ has said demands from us the proper response to His tomb. Let us not assume. Let us be sure. Let us be afraid of this resurrection.